My millionaire wife told the court I was sterile, froze our accounts, and flaunted her new lover in front of me. The judge opened the sealed envelope and read one line that made her mother faint. The records were hers. My name's Liam Carter, and if you're looking for a fairy tale about marrying rich and living happily ever after, you might want to stop reading right now and go watch some Disney movie where the mice do the heavy lifting. Because my story? Yeah, it's more like a cautionary tale they should show in high school economics class under the section titled, Why Prenups Exist and Gold Diggers Come in All Genders. I'm 33 years old, a part-time mechanical engineer who can fix just about anything with a motor, and a full-time idiot who genuinely believed that marrying a millionaire would come with perks like peace of mind, breakfast in bed, and maybe not having to check my bank account before buying coffee. Instead, what it actually came with was a stack of lawsuits thick enough to use as a doorstop, frozen bank accounts that made my credit card look like a museum artifact, and the kind of anxiety that makes you check your rearview mirror even when you're sitting on your couch. My wife, well, soon-to-be ex-wife, is Clarissa Beaumont Carter, though she only used the Carter part when it made her look charitable in magazine interviews. She built her empire from the ground up with a chain of beauty clinics called Radiance, which is basically code for, we'll charge you $3,000 to inject stuff in your face and convince you it's self-care. The woman turned vanity into a business model and PR lies into an art form. She was polished like a showroom Ferrari, powerful enough to make city councilmen nervous, and absolutely loved being admired by people who couldn't afford the tax on her shoes, let alone the actual shoes themselves. I met Clarissa 3.5 years ago at one of those charity auctions where rich people bid absurd amounts of money on ugly paintings just so they can tell other rich people they did it. I wasn't there as a guest. Obviously, my tax bracket doesn't exactly scream charity gala. I was volunteering with a buddy of mine, Marcus, who owned a small HVAC company. The venue's air conditioning had decided to stage a full-blown rebellion in the middle of August, and someone had the bright idea to call in professionals who'd work for exposure and free catering. So there I was, sweating through my shirt in a storage room that smelled like mothballs and regret, wrestling with a condenser unit that probably hadn't been serviced since the Clinton administration, when this woman walked in looking like she'd stepped off the cover of Vogue. She was wearing this white dress that probably cost more than my truck. Her blonde hair was pulled back in one of those effortless updos that definitely took an hour, and she had this smile that could sell you a timeshare in a swamp and make you feel grateful for the opportunity. "You're the AC guy?" she asked, tilting her head like I was some kind of exotic zoo animal. "That's me," I said, wiping grease off my hands with a rag that was only making things worse. "Liam, and you're definitely not supposed to be back here unless you're looking for storage or bad lighting." She laughed, this light, musical laugh that seemed designed in a laboratory to make men do stupid things. "I'm Clarissa. I just won the Rothko painting out there for $80,000, and I figured I'd escape the vultures for a minute. You mind?" I should have minded. I really should have minded. But instead, I said, "Be my guest." Fair warning though, it's about 100 degrees in here, and the conversation topics are limited to why people don't maintain their HVAC systems and whether this condenser is possessed by demons. She stayed for 20 minutes, asking me questions about what I did, where I was from, and why I wasn't out there in a tuxedo bidding on overpriced art. I told her the truth, that I was a working-class guy who fixed things for a living and had absolutely no business being anywhere near $80,000 paintings. And you know what she said? She said, "You're different. You're real. Yeah, different like a dog that still wags its tail after being kicked. Different like a parking meter in a neighborhood where everyone's got diplomatic plates. Different like the kind of idiot who hears 'you're different' from a beautiful millionaire and thinks it's a compliment instead of a warning label." She gave me her number on a business card that was thicker than normal paper, because apparently even business cards have a class system. I called her 3 days later, figuring she'd forgotten all about the grease monkey from the storage room. She hadn't. She invited me to dinner at this restaurant where the menu didn't have prices, which is always a red flag, but also kind of exciting when you're used to places that have combo meals. 8 months later, we were married at this destination wedding in Napa Valley that her mother, Vivian, had planned down to the napkin folds. I had 7 people there, my mom, my sister, a couple of buddies from work, and my cousin who mostly came for the open bar. Clarissa had 250 guests, 3 photographers, and a wedding planner who treated the whole thing like she was coordinating a G7 summit. For the first year, things were actually pretty good. Clarissa was building her empire. I was working as a contractor doing commercial HVAC installations. And we had this weird but functional dynamic where she'd host these fancy dinner parties and I'd fix the garbage disposal when it inevitably broke because someone tried to flush a lobster tail down the drain. Her friends thought I was charming. In that way, people describe things they think are beneath them but find amusing, like a pug in a sweater. But somewhere around year 2, things started shifting. Clarissa decided I should quit my contracting job and focus on family. She said we were going to build something together, which sounded romantic until I realized that what we were building was entirely in her name, on her property, with her money, and I was basically the construction worker who didn't get paid. My name was good for exactly 3 things: the utility bills, the grocery receipts, and giving her tax accountant something to write off as a dependent. Meanwhile, she bought a mansion in Pacific Heights with her name on every single document: deed, mortgage, insurance, all of it. When I asked about it, she said, "It's just easier this way, babe. Less complicated for the business." Easier. Right. It's also easier to cook a frog if you turn up the heat gradually. For 3 years, I was her unpaid therapist, listening to her complain about investors and employees while nodding like one of those dashboard bobbleheads. I was her chef, because God forbid she eat anything that didn't have the calorie count calculated to the decimal point. And I was her PR prop, showing up to charity events and investor meetings as the supportive husband who proved she was well-rounded and family-oriented. Then one morning, everything changed. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I was planning to meet Marcus for lunch and complain about my life like I did every Tuesday. Clarissa came down to the kitchen, poured me coffee with this smile that should have come with a hazard warning, kissed my cheek, and said, "Have a great day, honey." By noon, I couldn't buy that lunch with Marcus. My debit card got declined. I checked my banking app and saw a balance that said 0 with the kind of finality usually reserved for tombstones. I called the bank, figuring it was some kind of mistake or fraud. Nope. The accounts had been frozen by request of the account holder. Clarissa had locked me out of everything before lunch. I should have known that smile meant financial homicide. The courtroom smelled like old wood, stale coffee, and bad decisions. Specifically, my bad decision to marry someone whose idea of for better or worse apparently had an expiration date shorter than milk. I was sitting at a table that looked like it had witnessed every divorce in San Francisco since the gold rush, and honestly, I felt a weird kinship with that table. We'd both been through some things. We'd both seen people at their worst, and we were both probably going to need refinishing after this was over. My lawyer, Rachel Quinn, sat next to me looking like she'd walked out of a legal drama where the attorneys are all inexplicably attractive and wear suits that actually fit. She had this energy about her that said, "I've seen worse than you, and I've won," which was comforting in a terrifying sort of way. She'd spent the last 20 minutes reviewing documents with the kind of focus usually reserved for bomb disposal experts, occasionally muttering things under her breath like "unbelievable" and "are they actually this stupid?" Across the aisle sat Clarissa, looking like she was attending a gallery opening rather than her own divorce hearing. She wore a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than the average monthly rent in most American cities. Her hair was styled in those perfect waves that only happen in shampoo commercials or with a team of professionals, and she had this serene expression on her face like she was posing for a sculpture titled "Woman Who's About to Ruin Her Ex-Husband's Life and Feels Pretty Good About It." Behind her sat Dylan Martinez, her new boyfriend, who looked exactly like what you'd get if you asked a computer to generate generic personal trainer. The man was approximately 70% muscle, 20% spray tan, and 10% hair gel. His neck was so thick it looked like his head had been photoshopped onto his shoulders, and he wore a suit that was clearly struggling to contain his biceps. Every few minutes, he'd lean forward and whisper something to Clarissa, probably motivational quotes about believing in yourself or the importance of protein powder. Next to Dylan sat Vivian Beaumont, Clarissa's mother, who looked like she'd been preserved in formaldehyde and expensive face cream since 1987. She wore pearls so large they could have doubled as bocce balls, a navy dress that screamed, "I'm married into old money and never let anyone forget it," and an expression of pure disdain that she'd probably perfected over decades of looking down at waitstaff and people who shop at outlet malls. The woman had been shooting me death glares since I walked in, which was rich considering I was pretty sure she'd encouraged Clarissa to marry me in the first place because she thought I'd be manageable. The bailiff, a guy who looked like he'd been doing this job since the Ford administration and had long since stopped being impressed by anything, stood by the door with the posture of someone who'd rather be literally anywhere else. I couldn't blame him. If I had to watch people destroy each other 5 days a week, I'd probably develop that same expression of exhausted indifference. Judge Williams sat at his bench looking over documents with reading glasses perched on his nose, occasionally making notes with a pen that he clicked with the rhythm of a metronome. He was in his early 60s, had the kind of face that suggested he'd seen every trick in the divorce handbook and wasn't impressed by any of them, and radiated an energy that said, "I'm too old for your nonsense, but I'm getting paid either way." Then there was Richard Bell, Clarissa's lawyer, who stood up with the confidence of a man who'd never lost an argument with himself in the mirror. The guy looked like a bloodhound that had been stuffed into a $4,000 suit, jowls, sad eyes, and all, but with the predatory instinct of a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. He adjusted his tie, which probably cost more than my entire outfit including my watch and shoes, cleared his throat with the dramatic flair of a theater actor, and addressed the judge like he was about to deliver the Gettysburg Address. "Your Honor," Bell began, his voice dripping with the kind of practiced sympathy that defense attorneys use when they're about to throw someone under a bus. "My client, Mrs. Clarissa Beaumont Carter, comes before this court today seeking full division of marital assets due to circumstances that are both medically documented and emotionally devastating. Mr. Carter, despite presenting himself as a supportive spouse, has proven to be sterile and emotionally unfit for family life, a fact that has caused my client immeasurable pain and suffering over the course of their marriage." Sterile. The word hung in the air like a bad smell. I almost raised my hand like I was back in middle school and wanted to ask if they were talking about a different Liam Carter, because surely they couldn't be talking about me. I glanced at Rachel, who was writing something on her legal pad with a tiny smile that suggested she was either extremely confident or planning my funeral and enjoying the mental logistics. Furthermore, Bell continued, warming up to his performance, "Mr. Carter has demonstrated a pattern of emotional manipulation and financial dependency that has severely impacted Mrs. Beaumont Carter's business operations and personal well-being. He quit his employment at her suggestion, became entirely reliant on her income, and has contributed nothing of substance to the household beyond." He paused here for effect, looking at his notes like they pained him. Occasional home repairs and cooking meals. I wanted to stand up and point out that occasional home repairs included replumbing the entire guest bathroom after her mother clogged it during Thanksgiving, rewiring the kitchen after Clarissa decided she needed professional-grade appliances, and fixing the Tesla she'd backed into a fire hydrant while texting her publicist. But Rachel put her hand on my arm with just enough pressure to communicate, "Sit down and let them dig their own grave." Clarissa sat there looking like a porcelain statue, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that I was 90% sure was just a prop because I couldn't actually see any tears. She'd always been good at performing emotion. Came with the territory of running a business that sold people the illusion of perfection. Dylan reached forward and squeezed her shoulder in what I'm sure he thought was a supportive gesture, but looked more like he was checking if she was ripe. Vivian nodded along with everything Belle said, her pearls clacking together like some kind of wealthy wind chime. She leaned forward at one point and locked eyes with me, mouthing something that looked suspiciously like, "You're finished," which seemed unnecessarily dramatic even for her. Meanwhile, I sat there in my tie from Target, navy blue with thin stripes, purchased on sale for $12.99, which I only knew because the price tag had left a residue that I'd tried unsuccessfully to scrape off that morning, and a nervous stomach that was doing acrobatic routines that would have impressed Cirque du Soleil. My suit was off the rack from Macy's. My shoes were the same ones I'd worn to my cousin's wedding 4 years ago, and I'm pretty sure my socks didn't match, but it was dark in the courtroom, so I was banking on nobody noticing. But here's the thing, I wasn't panicking. Not yet, anyway. Because somewhere inside the judge's folder, buried between motions and counter-motions, and all the legal jargon that makes divorce sound like a particularly boring hostage negotiation, was an envelope. An envelope that I'd waited months to see opened. An envelope that Rachel had filed under seal with the kind of glee usually reserved for kids on Christmas morning. And trust me, Karma had RSVP'd for this hearing. She'd even brought a +1 named Truth, and they were about to make an entrance that would have made the Kardashians jealous. Look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that my marriage was always a dumpster fire wrapped in designer labels and passive-aggressive dinner parties. There was a time, brief, shining, and probably chemically influenced by the endorphins of new love, when things were actually pretty good. Or at least good enough that I could ignore the warning signs that were flashing like a check engine light on a car you really can't afford to fix. It hadn't always been a war zone. There was a solid 18 months there where Clarissa and I actually functioned like a couple that people didn't immediately place bets on divorcing. She had this way about her that could charm the air out of a room, leaving everyone slightly dizzy and wondering what just happened, while simultaneously feeling grateful they'd witnessed it. The woman could walk into a restaurant, make eye contact with a waiter, and suddenly we'd have a table that didn't exist 5 minutes ago. She could smile at a city inspector and somehow get permits that other people waited months for. It was like watching a magician work, except instead of pulling rabbits out of hats, she was pulling favors out of thin air. When we first got married, she told me she loved my humble nature. She'd say it at dinner parties while holding my hand, looking at me with those blue eyes that could sell ice to Eskimos, telling her friends how refreshing it was to be with someone who wasn't obsessed with status symbols and keeping up with the Joneses. Translation: she loved that I didn't make enough money to challenge her ego or have any real say in major decisions. I was humble the same way a houseplant is humble, decorative, occasionally useful, and completely non-threatening to the structural integrity of the building. About 6 months into the marriage, Clarissa started her campaign to get me to quit my contracting job. She was subtle about it at first, mentioning how tired I looked after long days installing commercial HVAC systems, suggesting that maybe I was spreading myself too thin, asking if I'd ever considered taking some time to figure out what I really wanted to do. Then she got less subtle, pointing out that we didn't need my income, which was true but also kind of missed the point, and that she wanted me to focus on family because we were going to build something together. That phrase, build something together, should have come with a disclaimer, like those pharmaceutical commercials where they list all the side effects while showing people having picnics. Side effects may include financial dependence, loss of identity, and discovering that together means you're the assistant and I'm the boss, and also we're not paying you. But I bought it. Like an idiot, I actually bought it. I gave my 2 weeks notice to the company I'd been with for 7 years, said goodbye to Marcus and the crew who'd become like brothers, and stepped into this new life where I was going to be a supportive partner, while Clarissa expanded her empire. Yeah, she built something all right. A 6-bedroom mansion in Pacific Heights with marble countertops, a wine cellar that could survive a nuclear apocalypse, and her name on every single document from the deed to the homeowner's insurance. My name was good for exactly 2 things: the utility bills and the Home Depot account where I charged supplies for all the repairs that kept the place from falling apart. For that first year or so of unemployment, I actually kept busy. I renovated the guest bathroom, installed custom shelving in her walk-in closet, which was roughly the size of my first apartment, and set up a home gym that Dylan would eventually use to work out while sleeping with my wife. I cooked elaborate meals using recipes from cooking shows I watched during the day, became weirdly invested in the lives of daytime talk show hosts, and slowly transformed into one of those people who gets excited about new vacuum cleaners and knows way too much about thread count. But then things shifted. It started when Clarissa decided we should have kids. Not, should we have kids, or what do you think about having kids? Just a firm declaration that we were having kids because all her friends were having kids and her business partners kept asking about it, and her mother wouldn't shut up about grandchildren. So we started trying, which sounds romantic, but was actually scheduled with the precision of a military operation. Clarissa tracked her ovulation like she was launching a satellite, bought every fertility supplement known to science and several that might have been invented by conspiracy theorists, and turned our bedroom into a laboratory where romance went to die. 6 months went by. Nothing. A year. Still nothing. Clarissa started getting that look. The one she'd give employees who didn't hit their quarterly targets. The one that suggested you were a problem that needed solving. Suddenly, the warmth in her voice froze faster than my checking account would eventually freeze, dropping from room temperature to Arctic in about the same time it takes to say, maybe we should relax about this. She blamed me for every failed pregnancy test, every negative result, every month that went by without the little plus sign she'd become obsessed with seeing. I went from husband to malfunctioning experiment faster than you can say performance anxiety. She'd make these little comments. Nothing overtly cruel, just small cuts that added up over time. Maybe if you exercised more. I read that stress affects fertility. Maybe you should try meditation. My friend Jennifer's husband is super healthy and they got pregnant immediately. Each comment was wrapped in concern the way poison comes in pretty packaging. That's when Dr. Patel entered our lives. Dr. Ramesh Patel ran a fertility clinic in Palo Alto that looked more like a luxury spa than a medical office, with water features in the waiting room, abstract art on the walls, and a receptionist named Stephanie who spoke in the kind of soothing tones usually reserved for hostage negotiations. We saw him 12 times over the course of 8 months, and each visit followed the same pattern. We'd check in together, sit in the waiting room making awkward small talk about the feng shui or whatever magazine article we were pretending to read, and then Clarissa would go in alone for what she called the consultation part. Every single time, she insisted on going in alone. She said it was too embarrassing for me, that discussing fertility issues was intimate and personal, and she needed space to be vulnerable with the doctor. Right. Because embarrassment was suddenly gender-specific, and apparently my feelings about discussing our inability to conceive were less important than her need for privacy. I sat in that waiting room for hours, reading magazines about home improvement and parenting. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Stephanie offered me tea and sympathetic smiles that suggested she'd seen this movie before and knew how it ended. When Clarissa would come out, she'd be tight-lipped about what was discussed, saying things like, Dr. Patel wants to run more tests, or we need to try a different approach, but never actually explaining what that meant. I asked to come in with her multiple times, suggested that maybe having both of us there would give Dr. Patel a better picture of the situation, but she always had a reason why that wasn't possible. He wanted to talk to her alone. The conversation was too clinical. She needed to discuss her medical history privately. It was always something. 6 months before I found myself sitting in that courtroom listening to a lawyer call me sterile with the confidence of someone reading the weather forecast, I was living in what I can only describe as marital purgatory. You know that feeling when you're waiting for the other shoe to drop, except the shoe is a designer's stiletto and it's aimed directly at your face? That was my life. Clarissa had become distant in that specific way that people get when they've already checked out mentally, but haven't figured out the logistics of the physical departure yet. She stopped asking about my day, which honestly was fine because my days consisted of grocery shopping, doing laundry, and watching enough HGTV to qualify for a degree in interior design. She started working late more often, which I knew was code for having dinner with Dylan, because nobody needs to review quarterly reports at a steakhouse until 10 p.m. unless those reports come with a side of infidelity and a spray-tan personal trainer. And she developed this habit of looking at me like I was a piece of furniture she was considering replacing, calculating, distant, already mentally browsing the catalog for an upgrade. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Why do all the worst things in my life happen on Tuesdays? When I found the legal documents on her desk. I wasn't snooping, for the record. I was looking for the warranty information for our dishwasher, which had started making a noise like a cement mixer full of angry cats. Her home office was off-limits normally, but desperate times and all that. Plus, I figured warranty information wasn't exactly classified material. The documents were in a manila folder labeled personal, in her perfect handwriting, which should have been my first clue to leave it alone. But curiosity is a hell of a drug, and I was already holding the folder. And honestly, what's the worst that could happen? Spoiler alert, I was about to find out. Inside were divorce drafts that looked like they'd been professionally prepared by someone who really enjoyed the concept of financial murder. There were property division plans that read like a PowerPoint presentation Satan would give at a conference called How to Completely Screw Over Your Spouse While Maintaining Plausible Deniability. Every asset was listed. The house, the cars, her business, even the damn wine collection, with detailed notes about how each item was solely owned by Clarissa Beaumont Carter and how my contributions were negligible and non-monetary in nature. There was a timeline, an actual timeline, like she was planning a product launch or a military invasion. Phase 1. Establish narrative of infertility. Phase 2. Document emotional incompatibility. Phase 3. Freeze joint accounts. The woman had literally created a strategic plan for destroying my life, complete with bullet points and target dates. I half expected to find a Gantt chart. I was still standing there, holding these documents like they were a positive pregnancy test in a horror movie, when Clarissa walked in. She stopped in the doorway, looked at me, looked at the folder in my hands, and had the audacity to sigh like I was the one inconveniencing her. "Clarissa," I said, and my voice sounded weird even to me. Too high, too tight, like someone was stepping on my throat. "What's this?" She didn't even pretend to be surprised or caught off guard. She just walked over to her desk, set down her Hermes purse that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and looked at me with the expression of someone who's been interrupted during a busy day. "Don't play dumb, Liam. It doesn't suit you, and frankly, we're past that point." "Past what point?" "The point where you tell your husband you're planning to divorce him? That point." She rolled her eyes. Actually rolled them, like I was being dramatic about discovering my wife's secret plan to financially eviscerate me. "I was going to tell you. Obviously. This week, actually. You just happened to find them first." "This week? You were planning to tell me this week? How considerate. Should I have checked my calendar? Did I miss the appointment reminder?" "Stop being theatrical," she said, and started organizing papers on her desk like we were discussing what to have for dinner instead of the complete dissolution of our marriage. "The truth is, Liam, I can't be tied to a man who can't give me children. I've tried. God knows I've tried. But I can't spend the rest of my life with someone who's fundamentally defective in that way." "Defective?" She said it with the same tone people use when they're returning a broken blender to Target. Casual. Matter of fact. Like I was a product that didn't meet specifications rather than a human being she'd promised to love in sickness and in health, for better or worse, till death do us part. Apparently with an asterisk that said, "Terms and conditions apply." "I'm not defective, Clarissa," Dr. Patel said. Dr. Patel said a lot of things, she interrupted, and there was something in her voice that should have tipped me off right then, but I was too busy processing the fact that my marriage was ending via accidental document discovery. "The point is, we're not compatible anymore. We want different things. I need to be with someone who can give me a family, and you can't do that. It's nobody's fault. It's just biology." That night, the worst Tuesday of my life, which is saying something, she packed a suitcase. Not all her things, just enough for a few weeks, like she was going on a business trip to Divorce Town. She moved through the house with the efficiency of someone who'd been planning this moment for months, which of course she had, because I'd literally held the evidence in my hands. She kissed the dog goodbye. Actually stopped, knelt down, and gave our golden retriever Murphy a full emotional farewell complete with forehead kisses and whispered promises to see him soon. Murphy, who had terrible taste in humans, wagged his tail and licked her face. Then she stood up, looked at me, and said, "Take care of yourself, Liam," like she was a co-worker leaving a job rather than a wife abandoning her husband. She left me with $300 in cash, literally counted it out on the kitchen counter like a severance package, and a credit card that I would discover the next morning was maxed out. The cash was supposedly for immediate expenses, which I guess meant groceries and gas, until I figured out that my entire financial life had been torched. The next day, while I was still trying to process what had happened and figure out how to pay for Murphy's dog food, she posted a photo on Instagram. Clarissa and Dylan at some beachfront restaurant, sunset in the background, his arm around her waist, both of them looking like an advertisement for infidelity. The caption read, "Finally, someone who makes me feel alive. Sunrise sparkles #new beginnings #authentic love #living my truth." I didn't comment. What was I supposed to say? "Hey, that's my wife you're making feel alive. Also, she left me with $300 in dog food expenses." But I did accidentally like it. Twice. The first time was genuine shock, like muscle memory from years of liking her posts, and I immediately unliked it. Then, in my panic to unlike it, I somehow liked it again. So for about 45 seconds, I was the pathetic ex-husband who liked his wife's new relationship announcement photo, which felt about right for where my life was at that moment. Then came the email. Clarissa sent a group message to basically everyone we knew, friends, neighbors, people we'd met once at a barbecue 3 years ago, with the subject line, "A difficult update." In it, she explained my medical condition, with just enough detail to be humiliating but vague enough to seem tasteful. She mentioned our fertility struggles, my inability to provide children, and her painful decision to move forward with someone who could give her the family she'd always dreamed of. Half of our friends stopped calling after that. Just ghosted me completely, like infertility was contagious or like they didn't want to pick sides, and it was easier to just pick hers by default. The other half sent me inspirational memes about staying strong, and everything happens for a reason, and my personal favorite, a sunset with text that said, "When one door closes, another opens." Thanks, Karen from Book Club. Really helpful. I'll just frame that meme and use it to pay my bills. That was the day I stopped being a husband and started being a ticking time bomb in khakis, quietly planning my revenge while the world assumed I was just another casualty of modern marriage. When the divorce summons arrived via certified mail, because apparently even ending a marriage requires a signature like you're receiving a package from Amazon. I was sitting on my sister's couch eating cereal that had definitely gone stale and watching a game show where people answer questions for money, which felt like a personal attack on my current financial situation. The mail carrier made me sign for it with this look of pity that suggested she'd delivered enough of these to recognize the manila envelope of doom. My sister, Amy, who'd taken me in after Clarissa pulled her financial disappearing act, grabbed the envelope before I could even process what it was. She worked as a paralegal for a corporate law firm downtown, which meant she recognized legal documents the way normal people recognize their own reflection. She tore it open, scanned the contents, and let out a whistle that made her cat jump off the windowsill. "Oh, she's going for blood," Amy said, flipping through pages. Full asset division, spousal support denial, claiming emotional distress, and, wait, is she seriously claiming you're infertile? Like, medically documented infertile. That's what she told everyone, I said, my mouth full of stale Lucky Charms, which felt thematically appropriate given my current luck. Dr. Patel's office confirmed it, apparently. She's been building this narrative for months. Amy looked at me like I'd just told her I believed in the tooth fairy. And you just accepted that? You didn't get a second opinion? You didn't ask to see the actual test results? She said it was embarrassing enough without me making it worse. That Dr. Patel wanted to respect her privacy during the consultations. I don't know, Amy. I trusted her. Which, in retrospect, was about as smart as trusting a fox to guard the henhouse while wearing a shirt that says, "I love chickens." That's when Amy got that look. The one she'd had since we were kids when she was about to do something that would either be brilliant or get us both grounded. Did you ever receive anything directly from Dr. Patel's office? Any paperwork with your name on it? I thought about it. Months of appointments, waiting rooms, and Clarissa disappearing behind closed doors while I read magazines about parenting techniques I'd apparently never get to use. No, she always said she'd handle the paperwork, that it was too depressing for me to. Liam, Amy interrupted, that's not how medical records work. If they ran tests on you, they have to provide you with results. It's literally the law. HIPAA doesn't care about your feelings or Clarissa's narrative. If you were tested, you have a right to those records. So we called Dr. Patel's office. Well, Amy called because I was having what I can only describe as an existential crisis involving stale cereal and the realization that I might have been massively played. Stephanie, the receptionist with the hostage negotiator voice, was extremely apologetic but also extremely clear that they couldn't discuss my medical information over the phone without proper verification. However, and this is where things got interesting, she mentioned that they'd sent duplicate copies of test results to my address months ago due to a clerical error, and that if I hadn't received them, I should contact their records department. I hadn't received anything. Or had I? I drove back to the house, technically still my house for another few weeks until the divorce was finalized, using the garage code that Clarissa hadn't thought to change because she probably assumed I was too broken to even try coming back. Murphy, my golden retriever who Clarissa had generously allowed me to keep because dogs don't photograph well, in living my best life, Instagram posts, went absolutely insane when he saw me, jumping and spinning like I'd been gone for years instead of weeks. I found the mail stash in her office, in a drawer labeled miscellaneous, which is where important things go to die. There were at least 40 pieces of mail addressed to me that she'd apparently intercepted, credit card offers, jury duty summons, a birthday card from my mom that was 3 months old, and at the very bottom, a large manila envelope from Riverside Fertility Center with confidential medical records stamped across the front in red letters. My hands were shaking when I opened it. Inside was a complete lab workup with my name on it, dated 8 months ago, right around the time Clarissa started telling everyone I was the reason we couldn't have kids. I'm not a doctor, but even I could understand the summary page that said in bold letters, "Patient shows normal reproductive health, sperm count, motility, and morphology all within optimal ranges." Optimal ranges. Olympic-level swimmers, according to the detailed analysis that used terminology I had to Google. My boys were apparently overachievers. Meanwhile, I'd been living for months thinking I was defective, broken, the reason our marriage was failing, while carrying around guilt heavier than Vivian's pearl collection. But that wasn't even the best part. Attached to my file with a paperclip, and this is where Dr. Patel's office really screwed up, or really came through, depending on your perspective, was another file. One marked, Confidential, C. Beaumont Carter. I shouldn't have read it. There were probably 17 different laws and ethical guidelines about reading someone else's medical records, even if that someone was your wife who'd been lying to you for months. But you know what? She'd frozen my bank accounts and told the world I was sterile, so I figured we were past the point of respecting boundaries. Clarissa had been diagnosed with secondary infertility 6 months before we even started trying to have kids. Endometriosis, blocked fallopian tubes, severely diminished ovarian reserve. Medical terms that basically meant her chances of conceiving naturally were somewhere between winning the lottery and getting struck by lightning. The doctor's notes included a recommendation for IVF with donor eggs and a comment that patient expressed concern about disclosure to spouse. She knew. The entire time, she knew. And she'd used me as a smokescreen, building a narrative where I was the problem so nobody would look at her medical records. It was genius, in a sociopathic kind of way. Can't have kids? Blame the husband. Want a divorce and take everything? Claim he's defective. Need sympathy and support while starting a new relationship? Play the victim who stayed as long as she could with a man who couldn't give her what she needed. I took photos of everything with my phone. Every page, every test result, every damning piece of evidence that proved I'd been set up like a bowling pin. Then I put the documents back exactly where I'd found them, because I'd watched enough legal dramas to know that stealing evidence was bad, but having evidence of evidence was just being smart. That's when I decided to fight back. Not with anger, though I had plenty of that, but with paperwork. Because if there's one thing that destroys rich people faster than a market crash, it's documentation that proves they're liars. I needed a lawyer, and not just any lawyer. I needed someone who wouldn't be intimidated by Clarissa's money or her bloodhound of an attorney or her mother's death glares. I needed someone who actually gave a damn about justice instead of just billing hours. Amy recommended Rachel Quinn, who she'd worked with on a few corporate cases. She's tough, Amy said. Like, really tough. She once made a CEO cry during a deposition, and not fake crying. Real crying, the kind where security had to bring tissues. But she's fair. She doesn't take cases she doesn't believe in. Rachel's office was in a converted warehouse in Soma, which should have been my first clue that she wasn't your typical corporate lawyer. The waiting area had exposed brick, industrial lighting, and furniture that looked like it came from a startup that went bankrupt. Her assistant, a guy named Marcus, not my Marcus from the HVAC days, different Marcus, offered me coffee that came from an espresso machine that looked like it could launch satellites. Rachel walked out 15 minutes later, and I immediately understood why CEOs cried during depositions. She had the face of an angel, sharp cheekbones, dark eyes, the kind of bone structure that magazines pay money for, and the energy of someone who could ruin your life before breakfast and still have time for yoga. She wore jeans, a blazer, and Converse sneakers, which somehow made her more intimidating than if she'd been in a power suit. "Liam Carter," she said, shaking my hand with a grip that suggested she could arm wrestle and win. "Amy speaks highly of you. Says your wife's trying to take you for everything you've got while claiming you're sterile. That about right. That's the short version, yeah." She grinned. It was the kind of grin that probably terrified opposing counsel. "You got proof you're not." I pulled out my phone and showed her the photos. She scrolled through them, her grin getting wider with each swipe, occasionally making noises of appreciation like she was viewing fine art. "Oh, this is good," she said. "This is really good." She falsified medical information, committed fraud, and probably violated about 6 different disclosure laws. Liam, you're about to turn this courtroom into a fireworks show. Question is, how much damage do you want to do? I want everything she tried to take from me, I said, plus my dignity back. And if possible, I'd like to watch her explain this to her mother. Rachel laughed. I like you. This is going to be fun. The first day of the actual trial felt less like a legal proceeding and more like opening night of a really expensive theater production where everyone was method acting and nobody had told me I was supposed to be the comic relief. Rachel had prepped me extensively over the previous 3 weeks, coaching me on how to sit, how to answer questions, how to not make faces when Clarissa inevitably lied under oath, and most importantly, how to project wronged but dignified husband rather than guy plotting revenge while smiling. I arrived at the courthouse 45 minutes early wearing a suit that Rachel had literally taken me shopping for because, in her words, you can't walk into battle looking like you're attending a funeral at a discount store. The new suit was charcoal gray, actually fit my shoulders, and came from a place where the salespeople work on commission and act like finding you pants is a spiritual calling. I felt like a fraud, but Rachel assured me that looking the part was half the battle, and the other half was having evidence that could sink a battleship. Clarissa, on the other hand, arrived exactly on time in a chauffeur-driven Mercedes that probably cost more than most people's houses, making an entrance that suggested she thought court TV was filming. She wore an ivory pantsuit that was so perfectly tailored it looked like it had been engineered by NASA scientists who specialized in making people look innocent. Her hair was styled in soft waves that probably required a team of professionals and several cans of hairspray. And she had this expression on her face that was 1 part serene confidence and 2 parts, I'm a victim, but I'm being brave about it. Dylan Martinez, her neck-free boyfriend, walked 2 steps behind her like some kind of designer bodyguard. The man had clearly spent the morning at the gym, because he had that freshly pumped look where every muscle was flexed even when he was just standing there breathing. He wore a suit that looked like it had been spray-painted onto his body, the buttons straining against his chest like they were one deep breath away from becoming projectiles. His hair was gelled into submission, his teeth were so white they were practically glowing, and he had the kind of tan that comes from either spending too much time in a tanning bed or being genetically gifted with melanin that I, as a guy who burns after 15 minutes in the sun, could only dream about. Behind them came Vivian Beaumont, Clarissa's mother, who looked like she'd gotten dressed by ransacking a Tiffany's store and a vintage Chanel boutique. Her pearls were so large they could have doubled as door knockers. She wore a navy dress that probably had its own insurance policy, and her face had that stretched look that comes from either excellent genetics or frequent visits to plastic surgeons who specialize in making people look perpetually surprised. She clutched a designer handbag that probably cost more than my new suit and surveyed the courthouse like she was evaluating real estate she'd never stooped low enough to purchase. The cameras outside were eating it up. Entertainment reporters, gossip bloggers, and at least 3 people with podcasts about rich people behaving badly had shown up because apparently my divorce had become content. Clarissa paused on the courthouse steps, turned slightly to give them her good side. She'd once explained in detail which side that was and why during a particularly narcissistic phase of our marriage, and offered a sad but brave smile that probably would have won her an Oscar if divorce court gave out awards for best performance in a legal drama. Inside the courtroom, Rachel sat at our table reviewing notes with the kind of focus that suggested she was planning a military campaign rather than a divorce trial. She dressed up today, relatively speaking, in a black suit with her Converse swapped out for actual professional shoes, though I noticed she'd drawn a tiny smiley face on the inside of her notepad where only I could see it, which felt like emotional support in doodle form. Here we go, she muttered as Clarissa's entourage filed in. Act natural. Look hurt, but not angry. Disappointed, but not bitter. Think, sad puppy who's too dignified to beg. That's a very specific emotional direction, I whispered back. I've been doing this for 12 years. Trust me, judges love sad, dignified puppies. Clarissa sat down at her table with the grace of a ballet dancer, crossing her legs at the ankle in that way women do when they've taken deportment classes or watched too many movies about royalty. Dylan took his seat in the row behind her, immediately leaning forward to squeeze her shoulder in what I'm sure he thought was a supportive gesture, but looked more like he was testing if she was real or a very expensive mannequin. Vivian positioned herself next to Dylan, shooting me a look that could have curdled milk. The woman had perfected the art of the death glare over decades of looking down at people she considered beneath her social station, which was basically everyone except other wealthy people and occasionally her hairdresser. At one point, she leaned forward and hissed something that looked suspiciously like, "You ruined my daughter's life," which was rich coming from someone who'd raised Clarissa to believe that people were either useful or disposable, and marriage was essentially a strategic business merger. I smiled back at her. Just a small, polite smile that said, "I know something you don't know, and you're going to hate it." Vivian's nostrils flared like a horse that had just smelled smoke, and she sat back with the kind of huff that suggested she wasn't used to people smiling at her when she was actively trying to intimidate them. Richard Bell, Clarissa's lawyer, arrived last in a flourish of expensive cologne and self-importance. The man carried a briefcase that looked like it cost more than a used car and wore cufflinks that caught the light every time he moved his arms, which was often because he was apparently a very expressive person. He nodded at Rachel with the kind of professional courtesy that barely masked the fact that he thought he was about to crush us like bugs under his Italian leather shoes. "Rachel," he said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "Always a pleasure. Though I'm afraid this one's fairly open and shut. My client has documentation, medical records, and—" "Save it for the judge, Richard," Rachel interrupted, not even looking up from her notes. "We both know you're full of it. The only question is whether you know you're full of it, or if Clarissa's been lying to you too." His smile faltered for just a second, barely noticeable unless you were watching for it, which I was, before snapping back into place like a rubber band. "We'll see about that." Judge Williams entered, and we all stood like well-trained dogs. He was a black man in his early 60s with gray hair, reading glasses that he wore on a chain around his neck like a stereotype of a librarian, and the expression of someone who'd presided over enough divorces to know that everyone lies, and the only question is how much. He settled into his chair with a sigh that suggested he'd rather be literally anywhere else, including stuck in traffic or attending a mandatory workplace sensitivity training. "All right," he said, looking over the case file with the enthusiasm of someone reading terms and conditions. "Carter versus Beaumont Carter. This should be straightforward. Mrs. Beaumont Carter is seeking full division of marital assets based on claims of infertility and emotional incompatibility. Mr. Carter is contesting. Do I have that right?" "Yes, Your Honor," both lawyers said in unison, which made them both look mildly annoyed at having agreed on something. "Then let's get started. Mr. Bell, your opening statement." Richard Bell stood up with the dramatic flair of a lawyer who definitely practiced this in front of a mirror. He buttoned his suit jacket, which is apparently what lawyers do when they're about to say something they think is important, and addressed the judge like he was narrating a documentary about human tragedy. "Your Honor, this is a case about broken promises and biological reality. My client, Clarissa Beaumont Carter, entered into marriage with the reasonable expectation of building a family. For 3 years, she supported her husband financially and emotionally while he failed to contribute meaningfully to either the household or her legitimate desire for children. I felt Rachel's hand on my arm, a gentle reminder to keep my face neutral even though I wanted to stand up and shout. That's literally the opposite of what happened, but sad, dignified puppies don't shout. So I just sat there looking wounded. "Mr. Carter," Bell continued, warming up now, "is medically infertile. A fact documented by Riverside Fertility Center and confirmed by multiple consultations. Rather than acknowledge this reality and seek alternatives, he became increasingly withdrawn, emotionally unavailable, and dependent on my client's generosity. She gave him every opportunity to be a partner. He failed. Now she simply seeks what is rightfully hers and the freedom to build the life she deserves with someone capable of giving her a family." Dylan actually nodded at that last part, like he was agreeing with himself about being capable, which would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. Judge Williams looked unimpressed. "Mr. Bell, I've read the filings. You're seeking full division of assets acquired during the marriage, despite California being a community property state. That's an uphill battle unless you've got something really compelling." "We do, Your Honor. Medical documentation, testimony from Dr. Patel, and a clear pattern of dependency and emotional manipulation. Miss Quinn. The judge turned to Rachel. Your response. Rachel stood up slowly, and I swear the temperature in the room dropped 5 degrees. Your Honor, this case is about fraud. Plain and simple. My client has been systematically lied to, financially abused, and publicly humiliated based on false medical information. We have evidence that will prove Mr. Carter is not infertile, has never been infertile, and that Mrs. Beaumont Carter knew this while building a false narrative to justify abandoning her marriage. Clarissa's face didn't change, but I saw her hand tighten on the armrest of her chair. Dylan leaned forward like he was about to say something, then thought better of it. Vivian looked like she'd just bitten into a lemon that had personally offended her. Furthermore, Rachel continued, we'll demonstrate that Mrs. Beaumont Carter committed fraud, violated multiple disclosure laws, and engaged in financial manipulation that would make a Ponzi scheme look honest. By the time we're done, Your Honor, the only question will be how much she owes my client, not the other way around. Judge Williams looked between both lawyers like a referee at a boxing match. This just got interesting. Let's proceed with testimony. Mr. Bell, call your first witness. And that's when the real circus began. The trial dragged on for 3 days that felt like 3 years, with Richard Bell parading witnesses through the courtroom like he was hosting a game show called Who Can Make Liam Look Worse? First up was Dr. Patel himself, who testified via video conference because apparently even fertility doctors can phone it in these days. He sat in what looked like his office, with diplomas visible in the background like set decoration, and spoke in that measured tone doctors use when they're explaining why you're dying, but want you to feel okay about it. In my professional opinion, Dr. Patel said, adjusting his glasses and looking at the camera with the sincerity of a man who'd definitely been coached by Richard Bell. Mr. and Mrs. Carter presented with fertility challenges that, based on initial consultations and Mrs. Carter's reports, appeared to stem from male factor infertility. Based on Mrs. Carter's reports, I wanted to jump up and highlight that phrase in neon yellow, but Rachel squeezed my arm hard enough to leave a mark, which I interpreted as shut up and let him dig his own grave. Then came the character witnesses. Clarissa's business partner, Monica, a woman who wore power suits like armor and had a handshake that could crack walnuts, testified about how devoted Clarissa had been to making the marriage work despite my apparent shortcomings. Monica described me as pleasant but unmotivated and emotionally distant during business functions, which was corporate speak for he didn't worship Clarissa like the rest of us, and that made us uncomfortable. Dylan took the stand on day 2, which was entertaining in the way watching someone try to assemble IKEA furniture without instructions is entertaining. Richard Bell asked him softball questions about his relationship with Clarissa, and Dylan answered in the kind of rehearsed statements that suggested he'd been practicing in the mirror while doing bicep curls. She's an amazing woman, Dylan said, his voice carrying the depth of a kiddie pool. When I met her, she was so sad about her situation with Liam. She really tried to make it work, but you can't fix something that's, like, fundamentally broken, you know? Rachel leaned over and whispered, did he just call you fundamentally broken while using like as a comma? I almost feel bad about what's coming. Almost. Even Vivian testified, which was something special. She sat in the witness box like she was posing for a portrait, her pearls catching the light every time she moved her head, and spoke about how I'd trapped her daughter in a loveless marriage by misrepresenting my ability to provide children. The woman had conviction, I'll give her that. She could probably sell ice to Eskimos if the Eskimos were gullible enough and impressed by expensive jewelry. My daughter sacrificed her best years for this man, Vivian declared, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. She supported him, encouraged him, and received nothing but disappointment in return. A mother knows when her child is suffering, and Clarissa has been suffering for years. Through all of this, Rachel remained calm, eerily calm, the kind of calm that makes you think either she's got everything under control or she's having a nervous breakdown and is really good at hiding it. She'd cross-examine witnesses with surgical precision, getting them to contradict themselves or admit they didn't actually have first-hand knowledge of half the things they were claiming, but she never went for the knockout punch. Not yet. We're letting them build their house of cards, she explained during a lunch break on day 2 while we ate sandwiches that tasted like anxiety and turkey. The higher they stack it, the more satisfying it'll be when it collapses. Trust me, Liam. I've done this before. The reveal only works if they're confident they've won. By day 3, Clarissa's side was so confident they'd basically started celebrating early. Richard Bell had this swagger like he'd already billed his victory bonus. Clarissa kept glancing at Dylan with little secret smiles, and Vivian looked like she was already planning how to spend the money her daughter would get from the settlement. They thought they'd buried me so deep I'd need archaeological equipment to get out. The final day came with all the drama of a season finale of a reality show that's somehow still on the air despite everyone agreeing it peaked 3 seasons ago. The courtroom was packed. Apparently word had gotten out that this was going to be good, and people who had nothing better to do with their Friday afternoon had shown up with the energy of fans waiting for a concert. I recognized some faces from Clarissa's social circle, probably there to watch my public humiliation and turn it into dinner party gossip. There were also a few reporters, some court regulars who apparently treated divorce proceedings like entertainment, and a law student sketching the scene who kept making eye contact with me like she felt sorry for me. Judge Williams walked in looking even more tired than usual, which I was starting to realize was just his default setting. The man had the energy of someone who'd seen every trick in the divorce playbook twice and was thoroughly unimpressed by all of them. He carried a coffee mug that said, "World's okayest judge," which I appreciated as a glimpse into his sense of humor, and he had that particular expression of someone who knows something interesting is about to happen and is curious to see how it plays out. Before we proceed with closing arguments, Judge Williams said, settling into his chair and putting on his reading glasses, "I've received a sealed envelope from Riverside Fertility Center. It was filed under seal by Ms. Quinn 2 weeks ago with a request that it be opened today in open court." The temperature in the room shifted. I could actually feel it, like when a storm is coming and the air pressure changes and dogs start acting weird. Clarissa shifted uncomfortably in her seat, uncrossing and recrossing her legs like she couldn't find a comfortable position. Dylan, who'd been sitting there looking smug and possibly thinking about protein shakes, suddenly sat up straighter and lost about 3 shades of his spray tan. Vivian's hand went to her pearls, clutching them like rosary beads or a protective talisman against incoming doom. Richard Bell stood up so fast he almost knocked over his water glass. "Your Honor, I object. We weren't informed about any sealed evidence. This is highly irregular and potentially prejudicial." "Sit down, Mr. Bell," Judge Williams said without looking up from the envelope he was now holding. "Ms. Quinn filed proper notice. Your client was informed. The fact that you apparently didn't take it seriously is not my problem." Rachel sat perfectly still next to me, but I could see the tiny smile playing at the corner of her mouth. This was her moment. This was what she'd been building toward for 3 weeks while the other side had been digging their hole deeper and deeper, and now they were about to discover they'd dug so deep they'd hit the water table. Judge Williams opened the envelope slowly, and I swear he was being dramatic about it, taking his time like he was revealing the winner of an award show. He pulled out several pages of medical documentation, adjusted his glasses, and began reading silently while the entire courtroom held its breath. The silence was excruciating. Somewhere in the back, someone coughed. A phone vibrated and got immediately silenced. The stenographer's fingers hovered over her keys like a pianist waiting for the conductor's signal. I could hear my own heartbeat, which was doing a drum solo that would have impressed a death metal band. Then Judge Williams began reading aloud, his voice carrying across the courtroom with the weight of absolute authority. Medical records from Riverside Fertility Center, dated October 15th of last year. Patient: Liam James Carter. Results of comprehensive fertility analysis show normal reproductive health. Sperm count, 68 million per milliliter, well above the WHO reference range of 15 million. Motility, 72%, classified as excellent. Morphology, 9% normal forms, within healthy parameters. He paused, looked up at the courtroom over his glasses, and continued. Summary: patient shows no indicators of infertility. Prognosis for natural conception, excellent. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that you could package and sell as soundproofing material. It was so complete, so absolute, that I think even people's thoughts stopped making noise. Then Judge Williams continued. Also included in this envelope is a second set of medical records. Patient: Clarissa Marie Beaumont Carter. Diagnosis: Secondary infertility due to severe endometriosis and bilateral fallopian tube blockage. Ovarian reserve testing indicates significantly diminished egg quality and quantity. Natural conception probability, less than 5%. Doctor's notes indicate, he paused here, and I swear he did it for dramatic effect. That patient was informed of diagnosis on March 3rd and explicitly requested that information not be disclosed to spouse. You could have heard a pin drop. Hell, you could have heard a pin think about dropping. The entire courtroom was frozen like someone had hit pause on reality. Clarissa's face went through several colors in rapid succession, starting at her normal porcelain shade, moving through pink, landing on red, taking a brief detour through white, and finally settling on a grayish tone that matched the courthouse walls. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish that had just realized it was out of water and the situation was not improving. Dylan's expression shifted from confused to horrified as he processed what this meant for his future with a woman who'd just been exposed as a liar in front of a packed courtroom. His eyes darted between Clarissa and the exit like he was calculating whether he could make it to the door before anyone asked him questions. But Vivian had the best reaction. Her hand, which had been clutching her pearls, went slack. The pearls, which probably cost more than a semester of college tuition, hit the floor with a series of clicks that sounded like a countdown to disaster. Her eyes rolled back in her head with the theatrical flair of a Victorian lady who'd just received shocking news, and she fainted straight backward like a tree that had been cut down, landing in Dylan's lap with a thump that made the bench shake. The courtroom erupted. People started talking all at once. Reporters were furiously typing on phones. The law student dropped her sketch pad, and someone in the back actually gasped. Like an actual audible gasp, the kind you only hear in movies or when someone discovers their spouse has been lying about fundamental biological facts for years. I leaned toward Rachel and whispered, "Guess I'm not the defective model after all." She grinned. "Not even close. Welcome back to the land of the fertile, functional, and about to be financially solvent." The courtroom chaos following Judge Williams' revelation was like watching a social media meltdown happen in real time. Except instead of angry tweets and deleted posts, we had actual humans having actual breakdowns in a government building with terrible acoustics. Vivian was still sprawled across Dylan's lap like a fainting goat, her pearls scattered across the floor where they rolled around making sad little clicking noises. Dylan looked like he was trying to calculate the fastest route to witness protection, and Clarissa just sat there frozen like a computer that had encountered an error it couldn't process. Richard Bell recovered first, because lawyers are basically cockroaches in expensive suits. They survive everything and somehow always land on their feet. He stood up, buttoning his jacket in that way lawyers do when they're about to say something desperate but want to sound confident, and addressed the judge with the kind of forced composure that comes from years of pretending disasters are actually strategic opportunities. "Your Honor," Bell began, his voice straining to maintain its earlier confidence. "This must be some kind of mistake. A clerical error, perhaps. These records could have been." "Mr. Bell," Judge Williams interrupted, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose like he was developing a migraine from the sheer audacity. "Are you suggesting that Riverside Fertility Center, a licensed medical facility, somehow mixed up two completely different patients' records, filed them incorrectly, and then coincidentally those mixed-up records perfectly contradict your entire case? Is that your legal strategy right now? Because I've got to tell you, I've heard some creative arguments in my 23 years on the bench, but that one might take the cake." Bell deflated slightly, like a balloon that had been poked with a needle but was still technically holding air. "No, Your Honor. I'm simply suggesting that perhaps these records should be independently verified before we." "They've been verified, Mr. Bell, by 3 separate medical experts." Ms. Quinn was thorough. "Sit down." Clarissa finally found her voice, which came out higher and more panicked than her usual controlled corporate tone. She stood up, nearly knocking over her chair, and addressed the judge directly with the kind of desperation that comes from watching your carefully constructed house of lies burn down while you're still inside it. "Your Honor, please," Clarissa said, and I could see her cycling through her usual charm offensive, trying to find the approach that would work. Her hands were shaking slightly, which I'd never seen before. Clarissa didn't shake. She was always perfectly controlled, always 3 steps ahead. But apparently finding out that your fraudulent divorce strategy had been completely exposed in front of a packed courtroom will do that to a person. This is clearly a misunderstanding. The records must be incomplete. Dr. Patel can explain. Mrs. Beaumont Carter, Judge Williams said, his voice carrying the kind of disappointed authority that made me glad I wasn't on the receiving end. I suggest you stop talking immediately and consult with your attorney, because everything you say right now is making your situation exponentially worse. And just so we're clear, I've already spoken with Dr. Patel. Off the record. This morning. He's currently very interested in cooperating with any potential investigations into how his medical records were misrepresented in court filings. Clarissa's mouth snapped shut. Richard Bell put his hand on her arm and pulled her back down into her seat, whispering urgently in her ear while she stared straight ahead like she was watching her entire life implode in slow motion. Behind them, someone was trying to revive Vivian using a bottle of water and what looked like an emergency granola bar, which seemed optimistic given that the woman had just witnessed her daughter being exposed as a fraud in the most public way possible. Rachel stood up with the kind of casual confidence that comes from knowing you've already won and now you're just running up the score for fun. She picked up a stack of papers from our table. Papers I recognized as the documents she'd been carefully organizing all week while humming show tunes under her breath, which I'd learned was her tell for when she was about to destroy someone's legal strategy. Your Honor, if I may, Rachel said, her voice sweet enough to cause cavities, but with an undercurrent of satisfaction that suggested she was enjoying this way more than professional ethics probably allowed. I'd like to present additional evidence that speaks to Mrs. Beaumont Carter's credibility and intentions. Proceed, Judge Williams said, and he actually leaned forward slightly, like someone settling in to watch a movie they'd been looking forward to. Rachel approached the bench and handed copies to the judge and to Richard Bell, who took them like he was accepting a live grenade. These are text messages between Mrs. Beaumont Carter and Mr. Dylan Martinez, recovered from phone records subpoenaed 3 weeks ago. I'd like to read a few excerpts into the record, if the court permits. Go ahead. Rachel cleared her throat and began reading in the same tone you might use to read a grocery list or assembly instructions, which somehow made the content even more damning. Text message from Clarissa Beaumont Carter to Dylan Martinez, dated January 14th, 9:47 p.m. Once everyone believes he's sterile, we can move forward with the divorce quietly. The narrative is set. Nobody will question it. A collective murmur went through the courtroom. I saw the law student frantically sketching what I assumed was Clarissa's facial expression, which had gone from pale to a shade of red that suggested her blood pressure was having its own crisis. Rachel continued, flipping to another page. January 22nd, 11:33 p.m. Liam still has no idea. Dr. Patel played along perfectly. By the time this gets to court, I'll have documented proof of his infertility and grounds for full asset retention. And my personal favorite, she said, allowing herself a small smile. February 3rd, 2:18 a.m. I almost feel bad, but then I remember he was always just a placeholder anyway. You're the upgrade I deserve, baby. Dylan actually recoiled like Rachel had thrown cold water on him. He scooted away from Clarissa on the bench, suddenly finding the wall very interesting and apparently trying to merge with it through sheer willpower. Several people in the gallery laughed, not polite courtroom chuckles, but actual laughter that echoed off the wood paneling. There are approximately 47 more messages in this vein, Rachel continued, including detailed discussions of how to maximize asset retention, minimize Mr. Carter's claims, and, this is particularly interesting, how to manage the PR narrative to ensure Mrs. Beaumont Carter's business reputation remained intact while destroying her husband's credibility. Richard Bell looked like he was aging in real time, his jowls somehow becoming more pronounced as the weight of his client's lies settled on him. He stood up with the energy of a man walking to his own execution. Your Honor, I was not made aware of these messages. My client assured me. Your client lied to you, Mr. Bell, Judge Williams said flatly. She lied to you. She lied to this court. She lied to her husband, and she committed fraud. The only question now is how severely I'm going to rule against her. Clarissa tried one more time, standing up with tears streaming down her face. Real tears now, not the practiced kind she'd been using earlier. Your Honor, please, you have to understand, I was desperate for a family. I made mistakes, but I never meant. Sit down, Mrs. Beaumont Carter, the judge said, his voice cutting through her protest like a knife. You didn't make mistakes. Mistakes are accidental. You planned this. You executed it deliberately. You falsified medical information, manipulated court documents, and systematically destroyed your husband's reputation based on lies you knew were lies. That's not a mistake. That's fraud. That's emotional abuse. That's financial manipulation. And quite frankly, it's one of the more egregious cases I've seen in my career, and I once presided over a divorce where the husband tried to hide assets by claiming he'd gambled it all away at a casino that didn't exist. He banged his gavel, and the sound echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. This court finds in favor of Mr. Liam Carter. All marital assets are to be divided according to California community property law, with an additional award to Mr. Carter for damages resulting from deliberate fraud and emotional distress. Furthermore, Mrs. Beaumont Carter is ordered to pay Mr. Carter's legal fees in full, plus punitive damages to be calculated by the court within 30 days. Clarissa slumped in her chair like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Her perfect posture, maintained through years of deportment training and Pilates, completely collapsed. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs that sounded genuine because they probably were. Crying over getting caught is still crying, technically. Dylan had by this point moved to the row behind Clarissa, putting physical distance between himself and the scandal like it was contagious. He was studying the floor with the intensity of someone who'd just discovered it was the most fascinating thing he'd ever seen, probably wondering how quickly he could change his relationship status on Instagram and whether anyone would notice if he just quietly left the state. Vivian, who had finally regained consciousness thanks to the water and granola bar intervention, sat up and immediately started wailing like she was at a funeral. My daughter. What have you done to my daughter? This is a travesty, a mockery of justice. Ma'am, Judge Williams said, not even looking at her. Your daughter did this to herself. And if you don't quiet down, I'll have the bailiff escort you out. Vivian quieted down to angry muttering and death glares, clutching her recovered pearls like they were the only thing keeping her grounded to reality. I sat there, taking it all in, trying to process the fact that I'd just won. Not just won, demolished. Crushed. Achieved a legal victory so complete that people would probably tell stories about it at lawyer happy hours for years. Rachel was gathering her documents with the satisfied air of someone who'd just finished a particularly good meal, and next to me, I could feel my own grin spreading across my face. It wasn't a big grin. Not some dramatic movie moment where I throw my arms in the air or start celebrating. It was a small grin, the kind that says, I told you so, without actually saying anything. The kind of grin that communicates, remember when you froze my bank accounts and told everyone I was sterile and left me with $300 and a dog? Well, how's that working out for you? The type of grin that's classier than open celebration, but somehow more satisfying. I leaned over to Rachel and whispered, did that actually just happen? She grinned back. That actually just happened. Welcome to the best day of your divorce, Liam Carter. When it was over, and I mean really over, not just the judge has ruled, over, but pack up your stuff and get out of the courtroom before the bailiff asks you to leave. Over. Rachel handed me a manila folder that was significantly thinner than the one that had started this whole mess. Inside was the court order, typed up in official legal language that basically translated to Clarissa screwed up so monumentously that she's lucky we're not charging her with fraud, and also here's all your money back with interest. The settlement was beautiful in its simplicity. Full restoration of all marital assets meant I was getting half of everything. The house, the cars, the wine collection that Vivian had spent decades curating, even the damn Le Creuset cookware that Clarissa had bought to impress dinner guests and never actually used. But the real kicker was the damages. Judge Williams had awarded me compensatory damages for emotional distress, punitive damages for the fraud, and legal fees that were going to make Richard Bell's accountant weep into their calculator. You're going to be okay, Rachel said, organizing her files with the kind of satisfaction that suggested she was already planning what story to tell at her next dinner party. Better than okay, actually. Once this settles and the assets are divided, you're looking at walking away with approximately $2.3 million, plus the duplex in Oakland that Clarissa forgot to list in the initial filing. plus your legal fees covered, plus enough punitive damages to buy yourself something nice. $2.3 million, I repeated, because apparently my brain had decided to process information by just echoing it back like a confused parrot. That's more money than I've earned in my entire life combined. Yeah, well, that's what happens when you marry someone who built a beauty empire and then she tries to screw you over using fraud. The court doesn't like fraud. Judges really don't like fraud. And Judge Williams especially doesn't like fraud committed by rich people who think they're above consequences. You basically hit the legal lottery, Liam, except instead of buying a ticket, you just had to survive 3 years of marriage to a narcissist. We walked out of the courtroom together, Rachel's heels clicking on the marble floors with the rhythm of a victory march. Behind us, I could hear the chaos of Clarissa's world falling apart. Vivian's voice raised an angry complaint about how the legal system was broken and corrupt. Richard Bell trying to do damage control while probably updating his resume in his head, and Dylan having what sounded like an emotional crisis that involved the phrase, "I didn't sign up for this," repeated several times. The courthouse steps were still crowded with reporters, bloggers, and people with too much time and a fascination with other people's drama. They swarmed around us like we were celebrities instead of just two people who'd survived a legal battle. Cameras flashed, microphones got shoved in our faces, and someone shouted a question about whether I planned to write a book about this experience, which honestly hadn't occurred to me, but now seemed like a potentially lucrative idea. Rachel handled it like a pro, giving them just enough to make good headlines without saying anything that could be used against us later. My client is pleased with the court's decision and looks forward to moving on with his life. Justice was served today, and that's all we have to say on the matter. Then she steered me toward the parking garage with the firm grip of someone herding a confused sheep away from wolves. We were halfway to her car when I heard the voice I'd been married to for 3 years calling my name. Liam, wait. Please. I turned around against my better judgment, and Rachel's immediate eye roll that suggested this was a bad idea. To see Clarissa running after us in her expensive heels, which was not designed for running, and made her look like a baby giraffe trying to figure out how legs work. Her makeup was ruined, mascara streaked down her face like war paint applied by someone having a breakdown, and her perfect hair had come partially undone from its professional styling. She looked, in short, like a human being instead of the polished corporate statue she'd been presenting for years. Dylan was nowhere to be seen, probably already planning his exit strategy and updating his dating profile to remove any mention of being in a relationship. Vivian was still inside the courthouse, likely berating anyone within earshot about the injustice of it all. So it was just Clarissa, out of breath and desperate, with the weight of her lies finally catching up to her. Liam, please, she gasped, stopping a few feet away like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to get closer. Can we talk? Just for a minute. I need to explain. Explain what exactly? I asked, surprised at how calm my voice sounded. I'd expected to feel angry or vindicated or something big and dramatic. But mostly I just felt tired. Explain how you lied about medical records? Or how you froze my accounts? Or how you told everyone I was sterile while knowing you were the one with fertility issues? Which part did you want to explain, Clarissa? She flinched like I'd slapped her. I made a mistake. A huge mistake. I was scared and desperate, and I didn't know what else to do. I wanted a family so badly, and when I found out I couldn't have one, I panicked. And then everything spiraled out of control, and I couldn't figure out how to fix it without admitting what I'd done. So you decided to destroy my reputation instead? That was your solution? I wasn't thinking clearly, she said, and new tears started flowing, which would have been more effective if I hadn't watched her fake cry for 3 years whenever she wanted something. I know I hurt you. I know I did terrible things. But we had something good once, didn't we? Before all of this? Can't we? No, I said simply. Whatever we had is gone, Clarissa. You killed it when you decided I was disposable. You cremated it when you froze my bank accounts. And you scattered the ashes when you told the world I was defective to cover up your own issues. Rachel stepped forward, positioning herself slightly between us like a very fashionable human shield. Mrs. Beaumont Carter, I strongly suggest you stop talking to my client. You've done enough damage. Anything else you say could potentially impact the settlement. And trust me, you don't want to make this worse for yourself. Clarissa looked at me one more time, her blue eyes red-rimmed and desperate. Liam, please. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I believe you're sorry, I said, and I meant it. I believe you're sorry you got caught. I believe you're sorry the plan didn't work. I believe you're sorry that your boyfriend is probably already ghosting you and your mother is going to make your life hell for the next decade. But I don't think you're sorry for what you did to me. I think you're just sorry it didn't work out the way you wanted. She opened her mouth like she was going to argue, then closed it again. What was there to say? We both knew I was right. Clarissa, I added, feeling generous in victory. You made several mistakes. Actually, dozens of mistakes. But the biggest one wasn't the fraud or the lies or even the infidelity. The biggest mistake was underestimating me. You thought I'd just roll over and take it. That I'd be too embarrassed or too broken or too stupid to fight back. And most of all, you forgot that sometimes the underdog wins. Rachel tugged on my arm. Liam, we should go. She can have her breakdown somewhere that isn't our problem. We walked away, leaving Clarissa standing there on the courthouse steps looking like the lead actress in a tragedy she'd written herself. As we reached Rachel's car, a Tesla, because of course Rachel drove a Tesla, I heard a horn honk and turned to see Vivian's Mercedes pulling up to the curb. The window rolled down and Vivian leaned out, her face twisted with rage and what looked like she'd been crying or possibly strangling someone. It was hard to tell. This isn't over, Liam Carter, she shrieked, her voice carrying across the parking structure. We'll appeal. We'll fight this. You haven't won. Actually, Rachel called back cheerfully, he has won. Definitively. And if you appeal, you're just going to waste more money and probably get sanctioned by the court for filing frivolous motions. But hey, it's your money. Well, actually it's Clarissa's money. Or it was. Now a good chunk of it is Liam's money. Have a great day. She climbed in her car and I followed, both of us laughing like teenagers who'd just pulled off an elaborate prank. As we pulled out of the parking structure, I looked back one last time to see Clarissa climbing into her mother's Mercedes, her shoulders slumped in defeat, and I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not anger, not even pity. Just a sort of peaceful emptiness, like closing a book you didn't enjoy and being glad it was over. You want to grab a drink? Rachel asked as we merged into traffic. Celebrate surviving marriage and coming out the other side with your dignity and bank account intact? Only if they serve freedom on tap, I said. I know just the place. We ended up at a dive bar in the Mission called Murphy's, no relation to my dog, that had sticky floors, questionable lighting, and the kind of atmosphere that suggested nobody here cared about your problems or your net worth. Rachel ordered whiskey, I ordered beer, and we sat at a table that wobbled like it had a personal vendetta against stability. To karma, Rachel said, raising her glass. To good lawyers, I countered. To idiots who think they can commit fraud and get away with it, she added. To that, I agreed, and we clinked glasses. The settlement cleared 2 weeks later. I watched my bank account go from negative to positive to numbers that made me dizzy, and I immediately called my mom to tell her she could retire from her grocery store cashier job if she wanted to. She cried. I cried. It was a whole thing. I rented a small apartment above a mechanic shop in Oakland. Noisy, greasy, smelled like motor oil and ambition, and absolutely perfect. Started working again, fixing engines, and drinking cheap beer with better friends. Marcus, my old HVAC buddy, hired me back part-time, which meant I got to spend my days doing actual work with actual tools instead of pretending to be a house husband. Murphy seemed happier too, probably because I was happier, or maybe because the apartment had a fire escape where he could sit and judge people walking by, which was his favorite hobby besides eating and sleeping. 3 months after the trial, I was living a life that looked nothing like the one I'd had with Clarissa, and that was exactly the point. My apartment above Jimmy's auto shop wasn't fancy. The walls were thin enough that I could hear every impact wrench and drop tool. The floor sloped slightly to the left like the building was perpetually shrugging, and sometimes the smell of motor oil was so strong I swear I could taste it. But it was mine. My name on the lease, my furniture that I'd picked out from a combination of IKEA and Craigslist, my weird collection of coffee mugs that didn't match because I'd stopped caring about things like aesthetic cohesion and started caring about whether the mug held enough caffeine to get me through the morning. Murphy loved it. He'd claimed the sunny spot by the window as his personal kingdom and spent his days watching the street below like a furry security guard who took his job seriously but never actually did anything about suspicious activity. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at me with those big brown eyes that seemed to say, "I always knew you'd figure it out eventually," which was either incredibly perceptive for a dog, or I was projecting my own feelings onto an animal whose primary concerns were food, walks, and whether that suspicious noise was a burglar or just the pipes settling. Work was good. Better than good, actually. Marcus had welcomed me back with a bear hug and a job offer that came with actual benefits and the kind of schedule where I knew when I was working and when I wasn't, which was a refreshing change from being on call 24/7 as someone's unpaid household maintenance department. We spent our days installing HVAC systems, troubleshooting electrical issues, and talking about normal things like sports and whether the new taco truck on 5th Street was worth the hype. Spoiler alert, it absolutely was. The money from the settlement sat in my account like a safety net I never thought I'd have. I wasn't being stupid with it, wasn't buying sports cars or taking trips to Dubai, or doing any of the things that lottery winners do before they end up broke and on a documentary about financial mistakes. I invested most of it, helped my mom retire like I'd promised, bought Marcus a new truck because his old one was held together by duct tape and prayer, and kept enough liquid to live comfortably without stress. Turns out, money can't buy happiness, but it can buy peace of mind, which is basically happiness's responsible older sibling. Every now and then, I'd see Clarissa on magazine covers at the grocery store checkout line. She'd reinvented herself as some kind of wellness guru, posting on Instagram about self-care journeys and healing from toxic relationships and living authentically, which was rich coming from someone who'd built an empire on selling people insecurity and had committed fraud to cover up medical issues. But that's the thing about people like Clarissa, they always land on their feet because they're too narcissistic to believe they've actually fallen. Self-care and damage control look remarkably similar these days, especially when you've got a good publicist and the attention span of the internet on your side. I didn't hate her anymore. Hate requires energy and emotional investment, and I had better things to do with both. Mostly, I just felt sorry for her. Sorry that she'd never learned that happiness doesn't come from controlling narratives or manipulating people or building perfect Instagram feeds. Sorry that she'd probably never realized that the problem wasn't me or fertility or any of the external things she'd blamed. The problem was that she couldn't be honest, even with herself. But me? I was happy. Genuinely, surprisingly, sometimes I wake up and have to remind myself this is real happy. I had friends who actually gave a damn about me, a job that felt meaningful, a dog who thought I was the greatest human ever invented, and an apartment that smelled like motor oil but felt like freedom. Because here's what I learned from the whole disaster. Sometimes the best revenge isn't ruining someone's life or getting even or proving you were right all along, though those things certainly don't hurt. The best revenge is living your life without them in it. It's waking up every morning without anxiety, eating breakfast without walking on eggshells, and going to bed knowing that tomorrow is yours to do with whatever you want because nobody's manipulating you or lying to you or treating you like a disposable appliance. People ask me sometimes how it all ended. Friends, co-workers, the woman at the coffee shop who remembered me from news coverage and has been weirdly invested in my story ever since. And when they ask, I just smile and give them the short version, an envelope and gravity. That's all it took. The judge opened one, and her mother handled the other. They always laugh. And then they usually want the full story, which I'm happy to provide because it really is a good story. The kind of story that reminds people that sometimes justice actually works, that liars eventually get caught, and that underdogs occasionally win not because they're stronger or smarter or richer, but because they're honest and they don't give up. I didn't just win the case. I got my life back. And honestly, it's a better life than the one I had before, because this time it's actually mine. No conditions, no manipulation, no strings attached. Just me, Murphy, an apartment that smells like motor oil, and a story that never fails to make people laugh. And you know what? That's more than enough.